House of Habsburg spent 3 centuries pursuing an ideal not of conquest or wealth but of purity. They believed that the right to rule was inherited solely through blood, and that blood could only be trusted if it remained untarnished, untainted by the common flow that ran through lesser families. The dynasty's obsession with lineage wasn't just a belief, it was a policy reinforced by papal dispensations and marriage contracts. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and siblings bore children who were destined to rule vast empires. Every union was an investment in a future where the Habsburg jaw would become more pronounced, where minds would cloud earlier and bodies would fail in increasingly predictable ways. Each generation brought forth a family tree so entwined that its roots and branches became inseparable, a design that celebrated singularity and feared dilution more than it feared deformity, madness, or death. This system didn't just destroy individuals, it shaped entire generations, crafting a template for how power could make any suffering seem justified. Any deformity was seen as divine will, a manifestation of the family's blessed bloodline. Charles V wasn't the first Habsburg to carry flawed blood, but he was the first emperor whose deformity couldn't be hidden behind courtly protocol or artfully angled portraits. Born in the winter of 1500, he entered the world with a jaw that defied human anatomy. The upper and lower portions of his jaw never met, creating a permanent gap that would define both his appearance and his reign. His lower jaw jutted out, pushing his teeth into positions where they could never align. His lips parted even in sleep, always slightly open. Drinking was a struggle, liquid would pull at the corners of his mouth, spilling down his chin. Eating was no easier, food swirled around in his mouth, without the typical grinding motion forcing him to swallow pieces whole or let them dissolve slowly on his tongue. His court physicians didn't call it a defect, though. Instead, they viewed it as a visible sign of his noble lineage, proof of his descent from Isabel and Ferdinand, the inheritance of a bloodline preserved through generations of carefully planned intermarriage. The pain began to intensify as he matured, and his misaligned bones continued to grow in distorted ways. His temples ached from the constant tension as muscles tried to compensate for joints that simply wouldn't work properly. His teeth ground against each other in uneven rhythms, wearing down the enamel and leaving his gums perpetually inflamed. Severe headaches became a fixture of his existence, radiating from his jaw through his skull with such intensity that they left him nauseous and unable to concentrate. Despite this, at 19 he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The pain in his face was hidden behind ceremonies that turned his physical suffering into a symbol of spiritual authority. No one in his court questioned whether a body in such distress could govern an empire that spanned continents. They saw his unique features as a mark of divine selection, not a genetic flaw. His profile appeared on coins that circulated throughout his empire, was carved into the facades of cathedrals built in his honor, and was woven into tapestries that decorated palaces from Vienna to Mexico City. Court artists learned to turn his protruding jaw into a noble feature, using shadow and perspective to transform what nature had rendered awkward into an imperial silhouette that suggested strength rather than deformity. As his physical condition worsened, Charles increasingly ruled through symbols and intermediaries rather than direct action. Chronic pain kept him seated during ceremonies that once demanded imperial mobility. His legs swelled, his fingers stiffened with arthritis, making the simple act of signing documents an ordeal. His spine curved forward under the weight of years spent compensating for the discomfort in his jaw. Still, the empire continued to function, operating on the idea of his presence, rather than his actual participation. His body may have been failing, but his political authority remained absolute. By the time he reached his 40s, the physical difficulties of eating had become so severe that meals had to be meticulously prepared. His tongue had thickened with age, and the chronic inflammation made it hard to move food around in his mouth. Kitchen staff had learned to soak his food, making it soft enough to press between his teeth rather than chew, and to serve it at just the right temperature to avoid triggering the sensitivity in his damaged gums. He spoke with increasing effort, his words often trailing saliva that servants discreetly managed, always careful not to draw attention to their emperor's distress. The simple act of dressing became an ordeal requiring assistance and considerable time, as his arthritic hands could no longer handle the intricate fastenings of his imperial regalia. Ministers and courtiers learned to arrive early for their appointments, knowing that their emperor's preparations couldn't be hurried without causing him more pain. Yet this growing reliance on others was reframed by the court as a sign of his devotion to duty, a ruler so committed to his responsibilities that he endured physical suffering for the sake of his subjects. When Charles finally abdicated in 1555, the ceremony was framed as a pious monarch's voluntary withdrawal seeking spiritual reflection, rather than the inevitable surrender of a man whose body could no longer bear the weight of rule. He retired to a monastery at Usti, where he lived not as a monk, but with a household of 50 servants who understood the delicate care required by someone whose basic functions had been compromised by decades of genetic inheritance made manifest. In his final years, he walked slowly through the monastery corridors, reciting prayers through teeth that caused him constant pain, taking meals alone to avoid the embarrassment of his eating difficulties. He kept mirrors covered and spent hours taking apart and reassembling clocks, perhaps finding in their mechanical precision the order his own body had never known. When he died in 1558, the empire mourned with elaborate ceremonies casting bronze effigies that preserved his distinctive profile for posterity. The official records made no mention of the daily indignities his condition had imposed, of the cloth kept constantly at hand to manage the saliva that collected at the corners of his mouth, the specially prepared foods that sustained him, the words he had struggled to form during his final years. He was remembered as majestic a ruler whose physical distinctiveness marked him as chosen by God, not as the product of inbreeding. In death, the Habsburgs learned a crucial lesson that would shape their approach to physical deformity for generations. Once a body was consecrated by imperial authority, its flaws were seen as marks of divine selection. If deformity could rule successfully, then deformity itself became proof of divine blessing, a logic that allowed even more physically compromised heirs to ascend thrones throughout Europe. Continuing the legacy of Charles V, Philip IV entered the throne room with the posture of an absolute monarch but the face of genetic mathematics. His jaw jutted forward in the unmistakable Habsburg line, angular, pronounced, shaped by centuries of bloodlines that had circled back upon themselves. Court painters softened the harsh angles in official portraits, adjusting shadows to create the illusion of symmetry, but the silhouette remained unchanged. The chin that reached beyond its natural boundaries, the lips that struggled to meet. The dynasty's signature was etched in bone and cartilage. Philip believed in blood just as all Habsburgs did, not compatibility. Not the unpredictable magic of love, but blood that recognized itself, that echoed its own patterns across generations. His first marriage was to his cousin Elizabeth of France. Their grandfathers had been brothers, their genealogies, parallel lines that court genealogists had carefully drawn together with mathematical precision. The match was arranged when she was just 13, not for love, but to align two bloodlines that already shared too much history. The wedding was celebrated as the perfect union of royal houses, a reinforcement of purity that the court promised would produce heirs of unparalleled legitimacy. Elizabeth bore an estimated 12 children during her marriage, with each birth following a troubling pattern. Some children arrived too early, their lungs unprepared for the air outside the palace walls. Others lived only briefly long enough to be baptized and held for a moment, before quietly being laid to rest in chapels, their names carved in marble too small to be read from a distance. Court physicians recorded each birth in bound volumes, describing symptoms in Latin, turning medical observation into religious mystery. The cycle became predictable, and wet nurses were prepared for various outcomes. Chaplains scheduled baptisms immediately after birth before complications could arise. Seamstresses kept cloth at the ready for burial. 10 children survived birth, but none made it past their 4th year. Some succumbed within hours, others after years of gradual decline. Yet through every loss, the court maintained its elaborate choreography of succession. Each child was celebrated as evidence of divine favor, and each loss reframed as God's mysterious will. The queen moved through her pregnancies surrounded by physicians who regularly bled her, priests who blessed her swelling belly, and courtiers who reassured her that the next child would surely be the healthy prince the empire required. Those who survived to adulthood often carried deformities that spoke of deeper structural failures, limbs bent at impossible angles, fixed in place as if the bones had forgotten their proper relationships. One daughter's spine curved so severely that she could never lie flat against her mattress. A son plagued with violent seizures eventually had his neck muscles torn by the convulsions, leaving him unable to hold his head upright in his final days. Elizabeth died young, worn down by pregnancies that drained her strength without producing the robust male heir that 3 centuries of Habsburg rule demanded. Philip mourned in the appropriate manner, then swiftly turned to the practical matter of replacement. The dynasty could not afford sentiment when survival was at stake. His second wife was chosen with even greater care. Marianne of Austria-Pommern was not merely his niece, she was the daughter of his sister and the granddaughter of his father. Her bloodline mirrored his own, refined through another generation of careful breeding. When her portrait arrived at court, months before her physical presence, courtiers noted how strongly she resembled the king. The same eyes, the same delicate features. The marriage represented not expansion, but concentration. While Elizabeth had introduced French blood that diluted the family's genetic consistency, Marianne offered intensification. Habsburg genes meeting. Habsburg genes in combinations that were mathematically precise and biologically hazardous. From this union came Carlos, not just another heir, but the most genetically deformed child ever born into the Habsburg line. Born in 1661, he embodied the precise result of 300 years of strategic inbreeding. Every feature that had marked previous generations of Habsburgs appeared in him, magnified: the misshapen head, the protruding tongue, the limbs that lacked coordination, the jaw that could not perform its basic functions. Philip IV held the infant, kissed his forehead as was protocol, and presented him to a court that cheered, not asking what had been created, but rather what had been preserved. When Philip died in 1665, his legacy was secured not through military victories or territorial expansion, but through the creation of a living testament to what happened when royal blood became too familiar with itself. The paintings that commemorated his reign depicted him as a patron of the arts, a defender of faith, and a king who had ensured the continuity of his dynasty. Carlos II, his son, inherited not only a throne, but the accumulated biological debt of a dynasty that had confused purity with strength, mistakenly equating genetic isolation with genetic superiority. The Habsburg system had successfully reproduced itself for another generation, but what it had reproduced was no longer power, it was the elegant mathematics of decline. Philip's legacy lived on in more than portraits and bloodlines. Across Europe, other Habsburg courts had observed, learned, and adapted the Spanish model. In Austria, they were about to discover what happened when the system's logic was applied not only to physical deformity but also to mental incapacity. The coronation chamber stretched beneath vaulted stone heavy with history. Ferdinand I stood motionless as the archbishop placed the crown on his misshapen skull, velvet cushions trembling under the weight of his unsteady limbs. His mouth hung open, not in awe, but because he had forgotten to close it, saliva pooling at the corners of his lips. A trumpet sounded. Ferdinand blinked several seconds later, delayed like an echo, then raised his hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or the start of a seizure. The movement was enough. The court erupted in orchestrated applause. He did not speak that day, because words tangled in his throat like fishing line consonants catching on a tongue too large for his mouth. The script had already been read by others, the oaths whispered by proxies. All that remained was the performance of presence, his body positioned correctly, his lineage intact, the throne occupied by something breathing and by Habsburg. From childhood, Ferdinand had been prepared not through education, but through careful curation. His seizures began before his 3rd birthday, violent enough to knock him unconscious, leaving him bleeding from bitten lips that never healed properly. He could not focus on lessons for more than minutes at a time, could not remember sequences longer than his name, could not pronounce complex words without his speech dissolving into wet stammering. Tutors were quietly replaced with attendants who specialized in managing rather than teaching. Lessons became routines. He was trained to walk along predetermined paths marked with subtle grooves in the marble floors, to repeat blessings in low, halting tones that almost sounded normal if no one listened too carefully. His world shrank to predictable shapes. Meals arrived at precise intervals. The clocks chimed to remind him of events he would not initiate. When he asked the same question twice, it was answered twice without correction. The imperial bureaucracy learned to function around his incapacity. Ministers spoke slowly and clearly in his presence, nodding respectfully at his vacant stare, then convened immediately afterward in adjacent chambers to make actual decisions. policies bore his signature, carefully guided by the steady hands, but carried intentions he could neither grasp nor remember. When he drooled during public ceremonies, they called it humility. His physical hesitations were reframed as thoughtful deliberation, his silence as wisdom, and his passivity as imperial restraint. During his reign, Ferdinand was not hidden away like some Gothic secret, but displayed constantly appearing at masses where he touched sacred relics held up for him, waving from balconies to crowds who cheered for a figure they could barely see. Every public gesture was rehearsed until his muscles remembered the motions even when his mind wandered. Servants buttoned his elaborate uniforms each morning, tied his shoes in double knots that wouldn't come undone, and helped him memorize speeches one phrase at a time. Words he forgot within hours but could repeat perfectly when prompted. In March 1848, revolution erupted across the empire like a fever breaking. Cities burned as crowds demanded constitutions, rights, and representation concepts Ferdinand could hardly understand. After months of upheaval, the court reached its inevitable conclusion: the emperor would abdicate not because he chose to, but because he had never truly chosen anything. They dressed him in formal robes and positioned him behind an ornate desk where an abdication document waited. He stared at the paper for several minutes, his head tilting at an angle that suggested either concentration or the onset of another seizure, before finally making his mark where they had indicated. Then he smiled, genuinely pleased to have completed the task successfully. The imperial court led him away as his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph, was brought forward to inherit an empire Ferdinand had never truly ruled. No public announcement explained the transition beyond the necessary legal formalities. The machinery of state simply adjusted its gears around a different figurehead. Ferdinand lived quietly in Prague for another 27 years, tending to gardens where he could remember the names of flowers better than the names of former ministers. He often spoke of events that had never occurred, and people who existed only in his deteriorating memory. But palace staff had long since stopped correcting him. In public memory, he became something harmless, the simple emperor, the gentle soul who stepped aside when his empire needed strength, a man who meant well but lacked the capacity for the harsh decisions governance required. Ferdinand had not stepped aside. His reign was neither brief nor tragic. It was 35 years of systematic demonstration that imperial power could function perfectly well without an emperor who understood it, as long as enough people were committed to maintaining the fiction that understanding mattered. Back in Spain, the genetic debt accumulated over generations was about to come due in full. The final heir would demonstrate not only what the system could survive, but what it had inevitably produced. No one in Habsburg history had ever carried such concentrated biological damage. The dining hall stretched 10 feet under stone arches, its walnut table surrounded by men in stiff lace collars, waiting for the king to nod before they spoke. But Carlos could not nod. His oversized head swayed, when unsupported, his chin drooping toward a chest that barely held him upright. Food arrived as lukewarm paste spooned past lips that never fully sealed. Each bite required the coordination his nervous system had never learned to manage. He chewed without teeth. They had rotted and fallen out by adolescence. He swallowed with visible effort, his throat muscles working against a tongue too large for his mouth. Sometimes he smiled, though the gesture twisted his face unnaturally, pulled sideways by a jaw too long and a tongue too wide. The silence in the room was not out of respect. It was calibration watching for the moment he might choke or forget to breathe. Carlos again inherited the Spanish throne in 1665 at the age of 4, the final product of the Habsburg Dynasty's 3-century experiment in genetic isolation. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was his father's niece, Philip IV, making Carlos the offspring of bloodlines that had circled back on themselves so many times that his family tree resembled a knot more than branches. Outside the palace, crowds cheered. Inside, doctors circled. By the time he reached 10, European courts were already exchanging medical reports about the Spanish king's condition. His skull had grown elongated and asymmetrical. His palate was severely clefted, making speech nearly impossible. His spine curved in multiple directions, leaving him unable to stand straight. One shoulder sat higher than the other, and his legs were so weak that walking required constant assistance. Yet every deformity was wrapped in ceremony. He was anointed with holy oils, painted him in portraits that softened his features, and carried through palace halls lined with tapestries thick enough to to muffle the sound of his laboured breathing. His marriage became the dynasty's most desperate gamble. First to Marie-Louise of Orléans, then after her death to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both unions were arranged with the understanding that producing an heir would require something approaching a miracle. Neither wife conceived, though court physicians never publicly acknowledged what palace records made clear. Carlos was physiologically incapable of reproduction. Instead, courtiers invented explanations to preserve the fiction of his virility. Astrologers blamed planetary alignments. Priests suspected witchcraft and performed exorcisms. Doctors prescribed increasingly desperate treatments, bloodletting herbal remedies, exposure to relics. Yet the truth remained unspoken. The Habsburg line had folded in on itself until it could no longer sustain even the most basic biological functions. By his 30s, Carlos required assistance for every physical task. His hands shook uncontrollably, making it impossible to sign documents or hold ceremonial objects. His torso sagged forward, supported by a specially designed throne that kept him upright during public appearances. Ministers choreographed his participation in state functions, positioning him so his presence suggested authority while others exercised real power. His final years were marked by hallucinations and complete physical deterioration. He spoke frequently to relatives who had been dead for decades, insisted that mirrors showed him faces other than his own, and required constant supervision to prevent injury during episodes of confusion. His hair fell out entirely, his eyes yellowed from liver failure, and his weight dropped to barely 90 pounds. He died in 1700 at the age of 39 after 35 years on the throne. The autopsy revealed the extent of his body's collapse: a heart the size of a peppercorn, gangrenous intestines, a single atrophied testicle, and a skull filled with excess fluid. The physician's report was copied, sealed, and filed away without public discussion. Carlos was not remembered as a cautionary tale. Instead, he was celebrated as proof that the Habsburg commitment to bloodline purity had endured another generation. Divine will, it was said, had sustained their chosen king through decades of suffering that would have killed ordinary men. His death marked the end of Spanish Habsburg rule, but not the end of the system that created him. That legacy continued in other royal houses, in other courts, where genetic mathematics still outweighed human biology, where the preservation of purity remained more important than the preservation of life. The halls remain quiet now, stretching endlessly through palaces, where footsteps once echoed with purpose. Long corridors of portraits line the walls, painted in faded crimson. Each canvas mounted in frames so heavily lacquered, they reflect the dim light like black mirrors. Every face repeats the same features that never changed across centuries: the jaw that extends beyond natural boundaries, the mouth that parts in permanent confusion, the lips that sag under their own weight. But the eyes in these portraits look steadily forward, painted with the confidence of divine right, as if nothing was ever wrong. They called it blood, sacred blood, divine blood, pure blood. They married faces that already looked like their own bodies, bred for proximity rather than vitality. Souls that carried identical genetic burdens wrapped in silk and presented as gifts from God. The court chroniclers painted it as continuity, the preservation of something precious that Leicester families could never understand. But it was compression. Generation after generation folded into itself like origami made from flesh and bone, each crease creating new distortions until the original shape was no longer recognizable. Again and again the same choice, again and again the same result. They knew what they were creating. They had always known. Physician reports were filed away in locked cabinets, detailed accounts of what happened when bloodlines curved back on themselves too many times. They watched children struggle to breathe, their airways compressed by skulls that had grown in the wrong directions. They buried infants before priests could reach the palace to perform last rites. They saw the pattern repeat with mathematical precision, the same deformities appearing in predictable combinations, the same struggles manifesting in each new generation. They changed the children's names, but never the breeding strategy. They commissioned fresh portraits, but never questioned the features they were immortalizing. They repeated the cycle not from ignorance, but from faith, a belief so absolute that evidence could not penetrate it. Purity was their religion, and deformity was the sacrifice they offered on its altar. This was not madness born from passion or accident. It was intelligent design implemented by people who understood genetics well enough to predict outcomes, but chose to pursue them anyway. A belief system that valued resemblance over renewal. A lineage so terrified of dilution that it preferred systematic damage. Better a son who could not speak clearly than a cousin who might introduce foreign blood. They transformed biology into loyalty, rebranded suffering as sanctity. Through it all, a dynasty that convinced itself this was beautiful, that found aesthetic pleasure in the repetition of deformity, that created an entire vocabulary to make genetic catastrophe sound like a spiritual achievement. And if you stand in those galleries long enough, if you trace the familiar lines of that jutting jaw from portrait to portrait, if you feel that something fundamental is not quite right, you are not mistaken. You are not seeing things that aren't there. You're simply looking at the final product of a system that understood exactly what it was doing and chose to do it anyway, generation after generation, until the choosing was no longer necessary because the pattern had become the only thing they knew how to create. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.